Welcome to Starter TV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We have the pleasure of having Dr. Wendy Suzuki with us today. Dr. Suzuki is a professor, a scientist, an entrepreneur, and author of a book, Healthy Brain, Happy Life. She's here to tell us more. Dr. Suzuki, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Let's start off by talking about the research behind your book and what actually led you to conducting the research behind your book. It was when you were in your 40s.
Yeah.
You were an award-winning scientist, world-renowned, had a great career. You seemed to have it all, but the bottom line was that you weren't happy?
Yeah, the bottom line was I ended up focusing too much on my work, and I had nothing else outside of work. I didn't have a big social network. All I did was work. All I did was talk to the people in my lab. And I stopped exercising. I really would spend all my time using my brain to think about the brain. And I knew something had to change. And there was actually a moment when I realized this. I went on a river rafting trip to Peru. And I was the weakest one on that whole trip. There were lots of triathletes on that trip, but also kind of normal people. And I couldn't help but notice that I was physically the weakest one on that trip. And I don't know, but there was just something about that did not sit right with me. I never wanted to be the weakest one on the trip again. And so literally the day after I got back from Peru, and I remember this because I had so many bug bites. I had bites on top of my bites. And I walked down to the gym and I signed up for a personal trainer, and I said, I am going to finally get in shape and really get regular about this. And somehow that was enough to push me to really get regular, and I really started to enjoy it, which was a big key. I like to take lots of classes, so different exercise classes. So there's great instructors in New York, and I really got active. And that's when I started to notice that not only did I get physically stronger and I was feeling much better, but my mood was significantly enhanced. And I remember there was one moment when I was writing my grants. So I have lots of grants to write. And I thought, gosh, this writing is going quite well. I'm able to focus my attention better, and I'm able to use my memory to remember different points from different papers that I'm summarizing to make a key point for the grant. And I thought, gosh, this is so much better than it used to be. And I made that link that I thought that one of the reasons it was better is that I was exercising much more regularly. And that's what took me back to the literature to ask, well, I'm a neuroscientist, what do we know about the effects of aerobic exercise on cognitive function? And it turns out there is a long literature on this, starting with studies in which they looked at the effects of what they call enriched environments on brain function. So it's basically like raising rats in Disney World. And what happens to the brain when you raise a rat in Disney World? Well, they saw that the outer covering of the brain actually got thicker. And there were more connections between the brain. There was different levels, higher levels of neurotransmitters. And one of the key aspects that made all those brain changes, it was the exercise. So that realization made me think, that must be happening to me. Wouldn't that be fascinating to understand how that's happening and how can I make that happen even more?
And you were also so focused on your career, and you had great relationships at work with work colleagues, but you also noticed that in social settings outside of work, you sometimes felt a little awkward and bored as well. What was happening at that time?
No, I didn't feel bored. I said I was boring. I realized later, I mean, if all you can do is talk about your work and you had nothing else to talk about, that's a little boring. So I was the one that was boring, and at the time I didn't quite know how to change that. But I started going to the gym because of the strength thing, and that alone just got me out of the lab. It got me to meet different people in all the classes that I was taking. And while we didn't immediately become friends instantaneously, it opened up a whole new kind of activity for me and let me be able to talk at least a little bit about something else than the lab. And it kind of snowballed from there. And you know, a lot of things changed. My mood changed, my just comfort level with people outside of science changed, and it really ended up transforming my life in a really profound way.
Why did you decide to write the book?
You know, I decided to write the book because I realized that all this information that I was both experiencing and researching from the literature and starting to research in my own lab, that is so valuable. And one of the reasons I'm so excited about this new line of research is that it has such profound implications. It has implications for children, and how come we're not giving them more physical education, PE, during their learning, during their schooling. To adults like me, who I want to maximize my memory and my attention and my creativity. I'm, at the height of my profession right now, and I want that. And then also implications for aging. We all want to enter aging with the strongest possible brain. And can we use exercise to enhance that and do that? So I see this as such an exciting area that has implications for our entire lifetime.
You're also a professor at NYU, and
Yes.
you conduct brain research there. Tell us a little bit more about your research.
For many years, I focused on parts of the brain that are critical for our ability to form new long-term memories. And so that has been my focus for literally the last 20 years. But more recently, about the last 5 or 6 years, of course, with the story that I just told you, I got fascinated with the effects of exercise on learning, memory, and cognition. And so the new research in my lab is focused on really 2 questions. The first basic question is, can we understand how much, what kind, and how long an exercise regime one needs to improve these key brain functions that I noticed in myself that were improving? And of course, this is also in the literature. Mood and memory and attention and even creativity. That's the first key question. The second question is, once we figure that out, once I can tell you, okay, exercise using this exercise regime for this long, and then you're going to improve your memory. Then the question is, how exactly is that happening? What is the mechanism? What are the signals that come from your muscles that are affecting your brain? What are the mechanisms in your brain that then cascade to improve your memory or your attention? A lot of open questions there, but fascinating ones and answerable. And so we're starting down the path to answer those 2 categories of questions.
Along the path of writing the book and going through this transformation, how did you define what happiness was for yourself?
That has really shifted over this kind of process. So happiness before was really defined by how many papers I published and how many grants that I had. But of course now I feel like with all of this work I've balanced my life much more. And for me, happiness at its core is how I feel about myself and my relationship to myself and how much I respect myself and how much I love myself. And then I could use that to then share with the rest of the world. And that is, for me, a very healthy way to think about happiness.
Your book is interesting because it's part memoir and part crash course in neuroscience. And your book really takes us down the journey of how you came along this path. What did you learn about yourself during the process of writing your book?
I learned a lot about myself when you have to really not just tell the story, but interpret. I had to interpret at each stage. And it was really wonderful. It was a real gift to be able to do that because I was able to process all of these events in my own life in a new way and kind of appreciate them on their own. So, there was a time in my life where I was so focused on work. But there's also a good part. I made a lot of progress there. I established a really exciting research lab. And so I was able to see the kind of the good and the bad all at once. And it was a process. At first it was, that was the terrible part of my life. I had no friends and that was terrible. And the no friends part wasn't good. But there is a good feeling from hard work, no matter what you do. And I definitely enjoyed that. And I kind of reveled in that during that period. But now I could say, it's so much more balanced that I can enjoy so many more things, not just the work, and I still enjoy the work very much, but a much richer social life and much richer kind of connections with a much wider range of people, and that's been really wonderful.
In the first chapter of your book, you talk about how a geeky girl fell in love with the brain,
Yes.
and how one of your professors at UC Berkeley, where you went to school,
Yeah.
was a real inspiration to you.
Yeah.
Tell us about your relationship with her and the importance of having a mentor in your life.
I have been so lucky to have just an extraordinary mentor. So I met her on the very first day of my freshman year at UC Berkeley. I took a freshman seminar class called The Brain and Its Potential. It just caught my eye. And I'll never forget that first day of class because, first of all, she kind of looked like a science rock star. So she's very tall, very athletic, very beautiful woman. She had this blonde bouffant hairdo that didn't look old-fashioned, just kind of made her look even taller. And she had this pretty blouse and skirt covered with a very crisp white lab coat. Very, very tall, very large hands, and she had gloves on her hands. But even more striking, sitting in front of her on the desk was a hat box. It was a flowered hat box. But what is that doing there? And I'll never forget that first day. She slowly opened the lid, and with her gloved hands, very, very lovingly, still remember how she did that, she pulled out a real preserved human brain. The first one that I had ever seen in my whole life. And not only, so that was just a stunning visual for a little freshman in her first day of college. But what struck me even more was that she told us that what she was holding in her hands was the most complex structure known to mankind. And you think, we all have one. It's just right here. You know, you're seeing it in her hands now, but we all have one. And it is the most complex thing known to mankind. And she told us about what we call brain plasticity, the ability of the brain to change in response to the environment. And how does that work? And that was her focus of her research. And I thought, that is the most interesting thing I have ever heard in my whole life. I want to be a neuroscientist. And so I was very lucky to have taken courses with Marion Diamond. She is, to this day, the best professor I've ever taken. And the reason is because she made it so personal. And she continues to be fascinated with her topic. And it was so genuine, her fascination. You wanted to understand it as deeply as she did and appreciate it as deeply as she did, just because you can see how interested she was in this topic. And by this time, she had been teaching it for 20 years. And I can say now that that's a hard thing, to keep up that genuine interest. But she did, and she made everybody learn and want to learn right along with her. But then, of course, I was able to work in her lab as well and learn how to do scientific research studying brain plasticity. And she, so how many different things did she do? She taught me in classes. She showed me what an extraordinary teacher really is. She introduced me to neuroscience. She introduced me to brain plasticity, which is the general topic that I've continued to this day. And so it was such a lucky meeting. And I know people say, well, I don't have a mentor. What if I don't have a mentor like that? Well, you know, something that I've realized only much later is that, so I have to say that I worked in Professor Diamond's lab when I was a senior, and I talked to her maybe 2 or 3 times, maybe 4 at the max, between, I graduated 28 years ago and today. So there was not a lot of direct, you know, she wasn't telling me, giving me advice about this, giving me advice about that. But what I've noticed is that she served as a role model for many things that came up later. So for example, I noticed in graduate school, the women graduate students, which at that point were 50-50, it was 50-50 male and female in my graduate class in neuroscience, they complained about not having a female mentor, a female role model. And I, not very charitably, ignored them. Because I said, what are you complaining about? I don't understand why you complain. And only later did I realize that I didn't have anything to complain about because I had the female role model. I didn't need to see anybody else succeeding because I had such a strong figure in my education. Of course I knew that women could do it. I knew that women who had 4 children and who had a career and who were extraordinary teachers could do it. Not that I put myself in the same league as her at that point, but it was possible. And I realized that she shielded me from all of that worry that maybe you're not going to make it because, look, there's not that many women out there. And yeah, I noticed it, but it never fazed me because I was kind of inoculated by having this amazing role model. And even later still, I realized that even how much more of a role model she was, because she started in the 1960s, where there were almost no women in science. And there she was in the 80s when I was in college, standing there like she belonged there. And it made me realize that that is what women in any profession can do to help other women. Be strong in your conviction that you deserve to be there, because you may not mentor somebody and give them advice about this and that and all the little things, but if they see that role model, that can last a lifetime. And so yes, I got much more interaction, but her role as a role model lasted that 28 years between the time I graduated and today. So I've been very lucky, and I literally try and pay it forward by standing in my role as a role model. And I'm not perfect, and yet it's great to be able just to stand there and say, I deserve to be there and you deserve to be there. And I think we need more of that attitude to help women kind of move forward at this period of time.
So brain plasticity is something that comes up a lot in your first chapter.
Yes.
And that's something that you're continuing to study. Can you tell us in layman terms,
Yeah.
what is brain plasticity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So brain plasticity is simply the idea that the brain, your brain and my brain, can respond to the environment. Now, there's so many different examples of brain plasticity. For example, if you play an instrument, your brain has changed because of all that. If you're a pianist, all the motor activity that you've done in all the practice that you've done, your brain and the motor areas of your brain have changed because of that experience. That's an example of brain plasticity. But an even more everyday example is memory. Things that you learn and remember, certainly if they stay in your long-term memory, have changed your brain. So even the fact of learning new things that you can do every single day is also an example of brain plasticity.
Some interesting examples you give around brain plasticity come from your study abroad trip in France.
Yes.
And involve food and music.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about this and
Yeah.
maybe give us some tips on how the
sure.
rest of us can achieve this?
I described this junior year abroad that I did in France, and this was after I had learned about all the brain changes that could happen when you raise a rat in what they called enriched environments. And those enriched environments are, again, kind of like the Disney World of environments, and it literally changes the connections and the size of different brain areas. And I realized that my trip to France was doing the same thing to me, because it immersed me in a completely different culture. The language was different. I was taking my science courses with all the other French students in French and having to take oral examinations in French, and that was very scary. All the new food, all the beautiful wine, I was in Bordeaux, really enhanced my life, changed and enhanced all the different flavors that I experienced. And my boyfriend, Francois, was something that also enhanced my life in new ways. So in terms of tips, I think the one that I love to give has to do with your sense of taste and smell. So as we all know, Bordeaux is a wonderful region for wine. And to bring that back to the brain and the study of neuroscience, there's only two parts of the brain where brand new brain cells can be born when you're an adult. One is in the olfactory bulb, important for smell, and the other one is in a structure critical for memory, called the hippocampus. So let's talk about the smell area of the brain. It's called the olfactory bulb. And they've shown in rats is that if they raise rats in what they call an enriched olfactory environment, which simply means you give them lots of different kinds of smells to smell, sometimes basil, sometimes peppermint, sometimes cinnamon, and you rotate that, and you compare their olfactory bulb to olfactory bulbs of rats that were not raised with that olfactory enrichment. The rats with olfactory enrichment have a bigger olfactory bulb and more brain cells. So it stimulates the birth of new brain cells. And so the idea is that somebody like a sommelier that tastes and differentiates between wine, or a student who moves to Bordeaux and starts to drink a lot more wine and differentiate between wine. I was in the process of stimulating the birth of new brain cells in the olfactory bulb, but everybody can do that. I'm not saying everybody go out and drink a lot of wine, but you know, you can do it with different flavors, you can do it with different cuisines, try African cuisine or Cambodian cuisine, and just start to pay attention to those different tastes and smells, and that should enhance not only your olfactory discriminative abilities, but also actually the size of your olfactory bulb.
You also started to become more intrigued with memory and the brain.
Yeah.
Tell us, what about memory intrigued you?
That is the topic that I got interested in when I went to graduate school. And I was interested in it at multiple different levels. Just from a brain plasticity point of view, an everyday example of brain plasticity, how can that work? How can things change so quickly in the brain, or did things change so quickly in the brain to underlie new memory? I was intrigued by that question. But I was also intrigued by the idea that memories could last, our memories can last 80 or sometimes 90 years. What is up with that? I mean, how does that happen? And the fact that these memories that can last, I mean, not all of them last 90 years, but the memories that do last, they define our personal identities, our own personal histories. And it's such a critical point. I mean, who are we without our memories of the last 5 years? I wouldn't be the same person if I didn't have the memories that I do have from the last 5 years. And so all of those things intrigued me.
So then from a scientific perspective, what makes something memorable, and how can we all enhance our memory?
So I can answer that question from many years of neuroscience research. So there are a number of different things that make things memorable. One is novelty. If something surprising and just completely out of the ordinary happens, you remember it. Our brains are tuned to novelty. I think evolutionarily it was a safety mechanism, because you want to focus on the new just in case it's dangerous. And you tend to not focus so much on things that you're very familiar with. So novelty will help you remember things. Emotional resonance is also a key to helping you remember things. So we tend to remember the happiest moments and also the saddest moments in our lives. And that's because there's an interaction with brain areas that are important for emotion and those that are encoding our memories. And basically that emotional area that's active for very happy and sad events supercharges the memories that are coming in that time, and helps them in that way. They say, I've gone to seminars with memory experts, you know, people that go to those memory contests that they have to memorize 100 different cards in a row in just 60 seconds. And they say the best way to help remember something, kind of in a random way, is make it funny. If you can somehow make a joke out of whatever combination or whatever sequence, it's easier to remember. And that gets back to the emotional resonance. Funny is also emotionally resonant. The other key is association. So if you want to remember something new, try and link it to something that you already know and remember well, because those are the things that are already strongly entrenched in your brain and your memory system. So try and link it that way. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it could help. So those are some key tips to improve your memory.
Another fascinating aspect of your research is that it tells you about learning and what is actually happening in the brain when we're learning. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What's going on in the brain when we learn?
Yeah, so that is the question that I was fascinated with when I got to NYU and wanted to know, because I was fascinated with it because we knew that this key structure important for memory called the hippocampus, that structure was really important for learning fast new kinds of information. Just sometimes you can learn things on a single trial and it would last for a long time. How does that happen? And what happens to the cells, the brain cells in the hippocampus as you are forming these new memories, these fast new memories? Not memories where it takes you, 50 trials to learn something new, but fast new memories. And so what we did is we asked animals to learn new associations, new combinations of things, and simply recorded the cells in the hippocampus as they were learning these things. Basically, we were having them play video games, memory video games. And what we found is, and I'll never forget hearing this for the first time, when you're recording from these cells, you can actually hear their activity. And brain cells communicate by brief bursts of electrical activity called action potentials. And on an audio monitor, it sounds like a little pop. So this little electrical pop. So it's pop, pop, pop. And I was recording from a cell as an animal was learning something new. And the cell didn't care. It was just kind of randomly firing, couldn't tell what was going on, until I noticed that the animal started to learn one of the associations that we asked him to learn. That the specific association is, we would give him a picture of a dog. When the dog came up, he would have to learn that it's the north target that would get him a reward. But when the cat came up, it was the south target. So he had to learn these different associations. So let's say he started to learn the dog association. And just at that time, I heard that cell start increasing its activity, where before it was kind of random. Every time that dog came up, the cell started really firing like mad. And I thought, that is interesting. And once I noticed that, I realized that in fact, in about 20% of the cells in the hippocampus, you can see cells start from nothing, no relationship if they're firing activity, until the animal learned something, not anything, a particular thing. And then that cell would start to fire. So what does that mean? That means that, for example, if I learn your name, your first and last name. So at first, I'm not going to remember it. Too complicated, don't remember it, and the cells in my hippocampus are not doing anything. But once I learn your name and I get it correct, I will have a not just one cell, but a network of hippocampal cells that will start to fire specifically to that learned piece of information. That's what we started to realize as we were doing these recordings, that we started to see this network of cells come online as new things were learned. And nobody had that view of new learning in the hippocampus before.
And what's the benefit of that when they all come together like that? What's happening?
That's a great question. The benefit is that you form a kind of coherent network of cells that, so these cells have just basically formed new connections between the dog and that particular target. And that is the basis, that network and that firing activity is basically your brain basis of that memory. That is the physical instantiation of what that memory is. And we're still trying to understand how that works and how does that last then for 90 years? Can we see it lasting for 90 years? Those are very, very difficult questions. But what I identified was basically the brain signature of the birth of a new memory.
And you've also been a TEDx speaker.
Yes.
And you've spoken about the connection between aerobic exercise, learning memory, and creativity.
Yes.
What is the connection?
Yeah, so that connection really focuses on this key brain area that's critical for long-term memory, this area called the hippocampus. And that connection is, I love to tell people this because they don't realize it. So as I mentioned before, there's only 2 brain areas where brand new brain cells are born when we're adults. And one of them is the olfactory bulb that I talked about before, and the second one is the hippocampus, this structure that we know is critical for memory. And so without doing anything special, both you and I have brand new hippocampal cells that are regularly being born in the hippocampus. But we now know that aerobic exercise can significantly enhance the number of new brain cells born in the hippocampus, as well as enhance their survival. Many of the new neurons born in the hippocampus die. But when you exercise, not only are more neurons born in the hippocampus, but more of them survive and get incorporated into the hippocampus. So why is that good? It's good because we know that these new brain cells are particularly active, and they seem to be particularly engaged in forming new memories. So I don't know about you, but I want as many brand new hippocampal cells as I can get. And we know that one of the answers to that is increased aerobic exercise. So I use that as my motivation to drag myself out of bed so I can get to my 6:30 a.m. kickboxing class in the morning, for example.
And what about creativity? What's the connection between exercise and creativity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I've just told you that exercise can enhance new neurons in the hippocampus, and we've known for such a long time that the hippocampus is important for memory. But much more recently, we've come to appreciate that another function of the hippocampus, beyond memory, is learning and memory, is the ability to imagine future scenarios. How do we know that? Well, a very smart researcher in London asked a group of patients with damage to their hippocampus, not only do you have a good memory, they had terrible memories, but can you imagine a tropical beach scene and describe it for me? None of them had been to a tropical beach. And they had a very difficult time doing that compared to their age and education match controls. Important to note that these subjects did not have language disabilities. They had perfectly normal language abilities. They just couldn't come up with a coherent description of something that they had never experienced before. And that led people to the understanding that one of the functions of the hippocampus is imagination, being able to put things in your memory and in your kind of database together in new ways, in an imaginative way. And as we know, imagination is a core function required of creativity. So one of the hypotheses that I'm working on right now is that exercise may not only enhance learning and memory, but it may help creativity as well. And I'm particularly interested in that because I feel like that's what I noticed in myself. Not only was my memory and my attention improved with exercise, but I feel like I've become much more creative, not only in my science, but also in my teaching since this exercise has come into my life.
What is your research telling you about the types of aerobic exercise that we should be doing to enhance our memory and our creativity, and the length of time we should be exercising?
Yeah, those are critical questions. And in fact, my lab is just starting to compare different kinds of aerobic exercise. We have a study going on in the lab comparing high intensity interval training with continuous aerobic exercise. We have another study looking at spin classes, and it's going to be a while before we can categorize, and everybody wants me to study their favorite exercise. And what I can say from the literature is that there's good evidence that aerobic exercise, lots of different ways people have studied aerobic exercise, but basically you have to get your heart rate up, and that is helpful for a range of different cognitive functions. Resistance training, for example, a little bit of evidence that it might be helpful, but not nearly as much as aerobic activity. And in terms of how long, that's a really hard one because all the different studies that have been done have used different age groups, different kinds of activity, and it's very difficult to come up with a general statement. And the other message that I have from the book, which is a critical one, you also do not have to become a triathlete, okay? So it's somewhere in the middle there. But what I'm trying to get at is kind of the minimum amount of exercise, because that's what everybody's interested in. What is the minimum amount that I have to do to get these brain changes? So it's going to be somewhere in the middle there.
How long will the research take? When do you expect to actually have some data around this?
Yeah, so our first big findings should be done by the end of the year. And so we're really excited to get those out. And we're looking at both, at two different aspects. What happens when you increase your exercise for a long term? So you go from low fit, not exercising, or exercising 30 minutes or less a week, to 3 times a week aerobic exercise. What does that do? but we're also interested in what's the effect of just going to the gym for an hour. What is that doing immediately for your cognition? And we have findings that hopefully will be published very soon showing that just 1 hour of cycling on an exercise bike can significantly improve your attention abilities, your ability to shift and focus attention for at least for lasting up to 2 hours after the workout. So, so hopefully in the next few years, we'll be able to answer the key questions.
So many organizations are also incorporating exercise and yoga and into their wellness programs. Tell us about what some of the benefits around creativity could be, as well as the bottom line.
So I think that all of those efforts to bring more exercise and meditation and yoga into the workplace are fantastic. I completely support that. I teach a free exercise class every week to anybody at NYU and even the New York City general public to come to for the last 6 years. I think it's critical. I do it for myself, to force myself, to have to exercise. I exercise more than once a week, but it's a great way to have to do that. So what are the benefits? The benefits are people have better attention. They are able to focus their attention better. They will have better memory. Mood is better. And as I just mentioned, there's some evidence suggesting that that could also enhance your creativity. Now, if I'm a business owner, that's what I want in my employees. I want creative, energetic people with good attention and good memory. And so it's just a win-win for everybody, both in terms of what the company wants, but also what an employee wants. As an employee, I want to have the sharpest brain that I can. And that's what you're doing with your wellness program. Yeah, you're improving your body, but you are tuning up your brain every single time you go to that program. And I think that's such a critical element and I applaud all the businesses that are starting to do that.
One of the chapters in your book talks about the mind-body connection, affirmations, mantras, and attaining a powerful level called intentional exercise.
Yeah.
Describe what that is and how we can achieve it.
So intentional exercise is simply the idea that in addition to whatever your favorite aerobic activity is, it could be, speed walking, it could be jogging, it could be kickboxing, what I suggest that you do is add a positive affirmation or a mantra to that exercise. And why do I suggest that? Well, I have experience with that. So the class that kind of really got me over the top in terms of my desire to come to the gym and my enthusiasm for coming to the gym is a workout that I learned and I now teach called Intensati. And it was developed by a wonderful fitness instructor in New York City named Patricia Moreno. And this exercise pairs physical movements from kickboxing and dance and yoga and martial arts with positive spoken affirmations. So in kickboxing, you just punch back and forth. But in Intensati, we say, I am strong now. And each movement is associated with a different positive affirmation. And the idea is that you're replacing negative thoughts that we all have every once in a while with these positive thoughts. And you're saying them out loud, which I think is a very important part of it as well. You're saying it out loud with a whole bunch of other sweaty people that are saying it out loud as well. So what is that doing? So I gave you a little flavor of some of the things that exercise is doing to your brain. So that's kind of going from your physical body and it's affecting your brain. Why? Because it's changing neurotransmitter levels. It's increasing those neurotransmitters that are involved in mood elevation. It is changing growth factors. Those are some of the growth factors that are helping those hippocampal cells be born and also helping the enhancement of your prefrontal cortex that's important for attention. So that's kind of the body back to the mind. So what are the intentions doing, the positive affirmations? That I've explored this and I currently have a hypothesis, and that hypothesis is that I think what the intentions are doing is going the other direction. It is affecting what psychologists call your mindset. So mindsets are your beliefs that can have real physical effects on your body. And one of my favorite examples of the power of mindset was a study done by a psychologist at Stanford named Alia Crum. And she went to a hotel and gathered all the hotel workers. First, she asked them all, do you exercise regularly? They all said no. To half of them, she said, we've analyzed your activity, all the sheets that you changed, all the floors that you scrub, and actually your level of activity is above the Surgeon General recommendation because they actually have a pretty good level of activity. To the other half, she said nothing. She brought them all back 3 months later, and what happened? The ones that were told that they had a higher level of activity, they lost significantly more weight than the other group, and they had significantly lower blood pressure and higher quality of, likability of the job. And so something changed in their brain, that idea that actually it's not that I don't exercise at all, I'm getting good exercise every single day. And what did that translate into? Actually, my body feels much better. I feel stronger. Those women actually lost weight. And so what are we doing with the affirmations? We are telling ourselves these positive things that are having physical effects on the body. And what are we saying to ourselves? I'm strong. I believe I will succeed. I am powerful. And for me, I can say it affects my stress levels. I'm not going around saying, oh God, I'm so worried this is going to happen. I'm going around saying, I'm powerful. I can handle this. I am strong. And it does have a physical effect on the body. So I'm so excited about this concept of intentional exercise because it's taking full advantage of the mind-body connection. The exercise part is going from your physical body up to your brain and doing all those brain changes that I talk about in the book. But the affirmations are going from your mind and having positive physiological effects back on your body. And that's why it's so powerful.
Yeah. The final chapters of your book talk about meditation. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening to our brains when we meditate scientifically, and how can we meditate on a daily basis?
Yeah. So we know about what happens in the brains of very, very expert meditators, and they have very different patterns of brain activity than you or I. Tibetan monks that have between 10,000 and 50,000 hours of meditation experience, and when neuroscientists have looked at the patterns of electrical activity that you can measure from the skull, this is EEG or electroencephalography, they find very, very high levels of a frequency of activity called gamma band activity, much higher than you'd see in normal people, non-meditators, or even people that have a little bit of experience in meditation. And not only are those patterns different when the controls or the monks are asked to meditate, but even in non-meditating conditions, they have much more of this activity, which probably relates to the idea that in Tibetan Buddhism, the idea is to be in a constant state of meditation. So it's not like, oh, now I'm going to try and meditate. You're always in this state. And that seemed to be reflected in this activity. So something about all of that activity seems to have enhanced and kind of strengthened the gamma band activity. Do we know exactly what that means? No, but we do know what the monks are particularly good at. They are amazingly good at focusing their attention inwardly on their breath, on a mantra. Actually, they were asked to do what's called loving kindness meditation in this particular paper, where you basically adopt an idea or a state of loving to everybody in the world. And you can start small with a puppy or a baby, but and work up to the people that you really don't like and try and do that. But that's what they were doing. And for the rest of us that may not be Tibetan monks, there are also studies showing that increases in meditation or meditation can decrease stress levels. They can have effects on attention, improve your attention, just like exercise does. And there's even studies suggesting that there are anatomical changes in people that have several years of meditation experience. So there's evidence that meditation, just like exercise, is causing brain plasticity. And that is fascinating because it's not that you have to work and you have to sweat to get this to happen. You can sit still and work your brain in a very different way and reap the benefits. And I think that's why so many people want to meditate. They get a little hint of that, and they want to try to bring more of that into their lives. And my best tip for trying to get on a meditation program, because as you know, I have a subchapter in my book called Confessions of a Yo-Yo Meditator. I've tried all the kinds of meditations and failed at many of them. And the trick was twofold. One, start small. You don't have to meditate for an hour. I still don't meditate for an hour. Just start with 1 minute of quiet. And also find the kind of, there's so many different, thousands of kinds of meditation. And I found one that I really enjoy, that I go back to over and over again. Just like exercise, find the kind that you like. You can start small. You don't have to become the triathlete. So that same strategy that worked for me for exercise and got me over the hump also ended up getting me over the hump for meditation. But I think people try, even 10 minutes can be too much, too long. And if you get frustrated those first few times, it makes it even harder to come back.
So we want to learn a little bit about you and your upbringing and your family. Tell us a little bit about your background.
So I am a third generation Japanese American. So my grandparents all came from Japan. My parents were born in California, and I was born in San Francisco. And we are lots of Japanese American families like ours are in California, lots of them. We're definitely American, but there's still that kind of Japanese work ethic and education ethic. My grandfather was the principal of the largest Japanese language school in San Francisco, and so education was always a big part of our upbringing. Yeah.
And what did you want to be when you were growing up?
Well, my secret desire when I was really young was to be a Broadway star, because my father is a huge Broadway fan, and he took us to all the traveling shows of all the Broadway hits when I was growing up. And I just thought that all those people that could sing and act and dance all at the same time were the most talented people that I had ever seen. And so I secretly wanted to be a Broadway star.
How did your family influence your career decisions?
Well, you know, they were always very supportive, and but it was clear they wanted me to do something serious, like doctor or a lawyer or some important sounding thing. And so, you know, they were thrilled that I wanted to. They didn't really know what a neuroscientist was, I think, at least at first, but they've been very supportive of my career choice. So.
You also founded an organization called Empowering New Scientists. Tell us more about the goal of the organization and what the original intent was.
So the original intent, it was actually first started with the title Empowering Women in Science. And we started a series of conversations with women, graduate students and postdocs, and even undergraduates, women that were interested in science. And this was work that I did in collaboration with coaching, a personal coaching company that I've worked with and I used before. And they basically brought in the same techniques that I used when I was kind of going through these transitions. So at the same time I was starting to exercise more, and I told you I didn't know how to change my social life. I knew how to get fit, and I did get fit, but there was still some problems with my social life, and so I went to a personal coach to get some tips. And they were very, very effective in basically helping me see what I was doing that maybe wasn't helping my chances to meet people and socially and dating wise, and but also it ended up shifting the way that I ran my lab and the way that I interacted with people in my lab, and helped me redefine the kinds of relationships that I wanted to have, not only in my lab but in my life. And so the idea was, these are valuable lessons, and particularly valuable for a population that will tend to be a minority. So women are a minority in science, even though they're not at the undergraduate level or even at the graduate student level. But they all know, and they're all very well aware, that at the highest levels, there's just not that many women. And so that's why we wanted to try and start these conversations with women scientists, not only at NYU, but we've done these programs at multiple universities as well.
And along with being a professor and a scientist and an author, you are now taking the path down entrepreneurship.
Yes, yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that.
So this is a very new venture, and I feel like it's just like being a new assistant professor again when I first got my position at NYU. There's a lot that I don't know, and the idea is to develop a new way to gather this key data that we've been talking about for the whole interview, that is how much, what kind, how long exercise do we need to do. And I want to do it in an entrepreneurial way where people come in and get the service from us to find out what kinds of cognitive benefits do they get from exercise, instead of doing it the traditional way with research grants. So just getting started on this, and really excited to see how that road goes.
Well, this was great, Wendy. Thank you so much for sharing so many insights with us.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. And we'll see you next time on Starter TV.